Hello, I'm Earl Lewis, your host, and welcome to a new episode of The Merging Point, where social justice meets social solutions. Today, we'll be discussing leadership, both in and outside of academia. In recent years, debates have swirled about affirmative action and diversity in higher education, and most of the legal challenges and public dialogue has focused on student populations. Comparatively little attention has been paid to the leadership of colleges and universities, let alone other institutions. The latest volume in the Our Compelling Interest book series, What Might Be, Confronting Racism to Transform Our Institutions, offers key insights on how organizations, the individuals who comprise them, and the leaders at their helms make informed, thoughtful, and ethical decisions. We think this volume and the ensuing discussion is timely because even as anti-racism practices seem to be gaining momentum, the nation shows signs of falling back into long-standing patterns of racial injustice and inequality. Individuals and leaders who introduce anti-racist approaches to their organizations, especially predominantly white organizations, have often faced backlash from white colleagues and skepticism from colleagues of color, leading to a kind of paralysis. In What Might Be, Susan Sturm explores how to navigate the contradictions built into our racialized history, relationships, and institutions. She calls these contradictions paradoxes, and in her book, she offers stories and strategies for confronting racism and the paradoxes, describing how change agents can move beyond talk to build the architecture of full participation. Joining us today is author and professor Susan Sturm. Susan Sturm is the George M. Jaffin Professor of Law and Social Responsibility and the founding director of the Center for Institutional and Social Change at Columbia Law School. She is the co-author with Lonnie Guinier of Who's Qualified, a New Democracy Forum on the Future of Affirmative Action. Today's episode will introduce her newly released book and will allow us to discuss organizational change, diversity, leadership, and anti-racist strategies. Susan, welcome.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be part of this podcast series. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. Now, you've chosen to focus on organizational change and leadership, and you start with two themes: the paradoxes of anti-racism and the sense that we're stuck in a kind of Groundhog Day approach to social justice. Tell us a little bit about what you mean.
So often, when people in institutions try to make change that is going to address racism, they take two steps forward and then one step back. It seems like whatever they do, there is a contrary move in the other direction. And these kinds of paradoxes can lead people to feel that there's no way to make forward progress. But in fact, those contradictions are both built into efforts to address racism, and they're also the key to being able to sustain change and leadership that will advance full participation. And so, just to give a sense of what those contradictions are, uh, when we're thinking about how to address racism in an organization, one question is, should we address these issues through the lens of race and racism? Or should we frame our challenges more broadly without mentioning race around things like belonging or thriving or economic prosperity? Uh, if you do one, if you don't talk about race, you're likely to lose the trust of people of color who will think that once again they're being pushed aside. And how do you solve a problem when you can't name it and document it and track it? And on the other hand, if you frame the issue only in terms of race, you might find it difficult to get the people to the table that you need to involve in order to make change. And you might sometimes confront legal challenges or political challenges that make your effort into a minefield. So you have to both talk about race and not talk about race. You have to be able to do both at the same time. Then there's the paradox of racialized power. People in predominantly white organizations that are white might say, I really need to step aside and allow people who have firsthand experience with racism to lead efforts to advance full participation and racism. But if they do that, they won't be exercising the power that they have to actually make change. And if they do exercise that power, they might be displacing the leadership of the people who actually do understand the way change needs to happen, who have been sidelined from participating in these decisions. So, do you step in or do you step out? You got to be able to do both. And then there's the paradox of racialized institutions, something you experience really deeply in a law school where I teach. Legal institutions are supposed to be part of, like higher education institutions, the process of advancing mobility and full participation. And we rely on them as drivers of justice, as drivers of equality, as drivers of democracy. And these very same institutions are the institutions that are perpetuating inequality, that are standing in the way of actually advancing full participation and might be tolerating or even perpetuating exclusion. So, what do we do? Do we work within institutions that are racialized in order to make change, when those same institutions have to be the very target of the change we're trying to make? And what I've learned is that we have to do both of these things at the same time, and that the key to transformational change is when you come up against those contradictions, not to walk away or to pick one, as the Supreme Court has tried to have us do, at the expense of the other, which only makes race more salient, whichever one you choose. That if you try to do both, that is how learning happens. That's how cross-racial mobilization happens. And is how institutional change towards full participation can become a long-term reality.
So, as we think about both the paradoxes themselves, how do we keep coming back to the same day? It's February. As we're sitting here talking, we've had our version of Groundhog Day, but here we come back and over again to the same spot. Um, Talk a little bit about why is it that we seem to inch forward and inch backward almost in parallel?
Well, one reason why we continually inch forward and backward is because some of the things that keep us in the paradox are structural issues that can keep us on one side or the other if we don't really pay attention. So, for example, the idea of perceptual segregation, and the idea that people actually grow up in segregated communities and have different experiences and understand the world differently, so might think they see the truth as a leader, a white leader. They may think their perspective is universal when in fact they see the world in very different ways than people who have experienced the world through the lens of racism. Or there's the problem of system justification, that there are all kinds of dynamics that lead people, including the people who are most hurt by the current status quo, to, to opt for that status quo rather than pushing for change. Um, and there are questions about, how do we define our roles? Do we define our roles in ways that keep us stuck? If you have a judge, for example, or a theater director who says, it's not my job to look at the impact of what I'm doing on people, I only call balls and strikes, or I only script the dialogue, then we leave the system and those paradoxes in place, and that gets us stuck. So part of what I think is really important is that we learn, and this is often an aha moment for my students and for leaders that I work with, that the way out of being stuck is, first of all, accept that these contradictions have to be navigated. You can't pick one side or the other. You have to hold both of them. That you're going to stick with this for the long haul, And we're not going to only rely on those operating within and at the behest of unjust institutions to make these changes, that we are going to turn everyone who has an interest in full participation into a change leader, and then figure out how to sustain that type of ongoing work at the local level and the institutional level, so that when the times are ripe, we're not starting back from square one. We're starting from a place that builds on these kinds of ongoing efforts of real people in real institutions and real communities that have stuck with it, even in the face of the kinds of challenges that we're facing now.
As our listeners reflect on what you're saying, they're going to probably also want to know, why did you decide to write this book now? Why is this the right time to try to take on these paradoxes and confront the Groundhog Day challenge and all?
I I decided to write the book in part because I was urged to do so over a long period of time by people that I've worked with, leaders in organizations, Nancy Cantor, your colleague, who's the editor of the series, and many of my students, because they were missing stories and strategies that focus on what do we do. They felt we have a lot of understanding of what the problems are and what the injustices are and what we need to change. But we need really concrete affirmative visions of what we want to move toward and how that change happens. So partly I've been thinking about that for my entire career. It becomes even more important to really talk about these issues of how to keep race on the table and why the paradoxes are key to being able to do that. Then the temptation when you feel that counter move against positive change, against fuller participation, is to throw up your hands and say, here we go again. There is no possibility of change. And that is the very thing that is really self fulfilling if we do that, right? And so at the very time when it looks like, if we're looking at people in formal positions of power, at the most powerful positions of our country, they're trying to shut down these efforts. Those of us that are working in institutions and in communities that can make day-to-day change, that can build really strong commitment among multiracial collaborations, we're the ones who can break out of that cycle. We're the ones who can lay the foundation for the next round when transformative change is possible. And if we look at history, those steps back became transformative when people did not give up, when people did dig in and say, we've got to do the work on the ground so that we're ready to do the work at an institutional, at a national level when the opportunity then presents itself.
As I listen to you, two words come to mind: hope and forward. And so as I think about hope and forward, the book itself is loaded with stories, individual stories. Talk to us a little bit about the art of writing the book, but also the method of selecting the stories to illustrate the points that you were trying to really bring to the fore.
It was so wonderful to be able to tell stories as the way of actually introducing so many of these ideas. One of the things that was so powerful about it is I have been working with people over the years, whether they are college classmates or people that I've collaborated with or studied or students who are these kinds of transformative change agents. And I got to see up close what they were struggling with and how they made these moves, and also where they succeeded and where they're still struggling. Uh, and so picking a story of a Freeman Rabowski, who's in the book, and some of the other people at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, or picking the story of an Andrea Levere, who's someone who I went to college with and who used her expertise in economic management to build prosperity for Black homeowners, or a Janine Tesori, who's a Tony Award winning composer who used her brilliance and her contacts and her commitment to change the way opera was experienced so that it could take on issues of police violence against Black communities and create opportunities for Black artists to remain committed to opera as an art form that could be transformative. These were the stories that actually brought to life some of these theoretical concepts that I've also learned about through my own research and also through research that others have done. Things like perceptual segregation, things like uh, you know uh, the conditions under which multiracial collaboration can happen, things like the importance of proximity. These are concepts that only come to life when you tell stories. So there was a kind of marriage of the stories that I've gravitated towards because I care about these concepts of linked fate. I care about these concepts of how you find boundary spanning um, change leaders. I care about these concepts of repurposing power and have learned from so many people about them. And so the stories and the concepts kind of developed in tandem. And I found that telling the stories made me understand theoretical concepts at a much deeper level. And people who were never interested in purely the concepts now can see themselves in the work. And that is really one of the things I really hope for with this book is that people will either recognize themselves already as change agents, just like the people in the book, or they will see that they too can be a change agent, that they can be a leader. You don't have to be the president or the executive director to be a leader. Some of the most transformative leaders are people who are using whatever position they have to mobilize change for a much larger group.
As you talk about change leaders and change making and all, come back to the personal for a second. As you're writing this book, you are affected by all of the systems that you are writing about. You too are, in a certain kind of way, in the book. How did you go about thinking about your own sort of positionality or role or relationship to the questions that you were posing as you were working through the concepts and the points you were trying to make?
I remember a conversation that I had early on in the writing of the book with a dean, not my dean of my law school, but another dean about the book. And I said I was writing a book about how people, including people like me who are white and in positions of relative power, push uh, for anti-racism, for full participation in predominantly white institutions. And he didn't miss a beat. He looked me in the eye and said, "You should not be writing this book. You are just going to get yourself in trouble." And I thought to myself, yes. And that's the kind of trouble someone like me needs to get into. That I want to embrace that. And I did struggle throughout the writing of this book with who I am in doing this work and what my legitimacy is as someone who is in a position of real safety and power within, uh, at least as compared to most people who are in a higher education institution, a tenured faculty member, white person standing in front of the room. And over the years, as I narrate in the book, in many ways, thanks to first and foremost to Lonnie Guinier, who the book is dedicated to, I learned that I couldn't solve these problems by myself, that I didn't know a lot of things, and that I was going to continue to make mistakes as I did this work, and that the mistakes were the openings. The getting caught in the paradox was the energy that would actually drive the ability to bring people together, and that my willingness to stay engaged and to share my own struggles was both how trust developed with people who were different than I am or differently positioned, and also how I could build the communities that it took to actually make this change. And so I learned a lot through writing the book. I learned a lot about vulnerability and also rigor with humanity. And that when you put those things together, then you have the possibility of reaching across divides that you might not otherwise be able to navigate.
I love your perspective, and it reminds me that too oftentimes leaders of organizations are confronted with the short term and don't have the privilege or the opportunity to think about the long term. And as a historian, 200 years seems like yesterday. And so I'm also reminded of that. So, what would you say to leaders about how they actually help to empower the rising leaders in their organizations? What should they be thinking about? I mean, one way to begin to change the present is to make sure that you empower those who will take on the mantle, that they are actually raising different questions, pursuing different strategies, following slightly different paths, recognizing that you can still get to the end of their journey, even if you don't do it exactly the way the current generation has done it. Are there things from what you've learned and about what might be if we actually free the next generation to chart a different course?
Yes, there are things that many things that come from these stories. I think about Shirley Collado, who was in the first cohort of the Posse Foundation, which is an organization that builds groups of people who are very talented but would be overlooked by existing measures of merit. And Shirley took those lessons that she learned by being in a group of incredibly talented people, but not just leaving them to uh, their own strengths, their own ways of figuring out, but providing that kind of strong support and also opportunities to lead. Part of what we saw with Shirley's work, and we saw this with Freeman Rabowski, we see it with the trial court that went through this transformational process, is opening up new spaces to be able to solve problems with the leadership of people who might not be in formal leadership roles, but are in positions, as long as they're given support, to develop the capacity and to have the opportunity to exercise leadership by addressing problems or challenges or doing new projects that allow them to have a real impact. And that then enables them to develop the capability so that they can step into more formal positions of leadership. So it's really by sharing power, people at the top of the organization create the opportunities for people at all different levels of the organization, inside and out, to build their own capacities to engage in solving problems that you can't solve from the top of the organization, and in the process to be equipped to then take on more formal leadership roles as those roles become open. And that can also push to reshaping the way organizations work so that there are more opportunities for people to exercise leadership in ways that bring to the table all the different kinds of expertise that are really needed to solve these kinds of hard problems. So I think anyone who gets into a position of leadership, and you know this better than I, Earl, anyone who gets into a position of leadership from day one is thinking, what's my succession plan and how do I multiply my position so that there are many more people who can exercise leadership for change by the time I leave. And if that's your commitment and you build it into everything that you do, it will happen. If you build it, they will come.
Well, thank you. We have been talking today with Susan Sturm about her new book, What Might Be: Confronting Racism to Transform Our Institutions. Before we conclude, Susan, any one final thought that you would like to share with our listeners?
I speak both in the book and throughout my work about this idea of full participation. Full participation is that organizations, institutions, communities need to build environments so that people of every race, of every gender, of every background can enter, succeed, thrive, and contribute to the thriving of others. You cannot advance full participation without addressing race and racism. If you leave many of the people who are in your community out from full participation, you do not have full participation and you do not have legitimacy. And full participation is absolutely critical to our democracy, especially at this moment when our democratic institutions are under such threat. So, being able to navigate these paradoxes so that we can address race as part of advancing full participation is absolutely critical to our democracy, to our linked fate. And it should be something that everyone feels they need to become a change agent to advance.
Susan, thank you. It's been a true pleasure. That concludes our episode for today. Thank you for listening to The Merging Point with our special guest, Susan Sturm. If you want to stay updated on The Merging Point and our work at the University of Michigan Center for Social Solutions, be sure to follow us on X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We'll be back soon with another exciting episode. Until then, thanks for listening.